Good morning. We're here today with Katy from Astra Law Group. Sorry, Katy Young for Astra Law Group. Katy, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you. Always a pleasure to talk to you. What's going on these days?
What is not going on? Well, as you said, I'm the managing partner of Ad Astra Law Group in San Francisco. In my spare time, I'm the president of the International Cannabis Bar Association. I'm a mom of two, one of the busiest people you'll meet on the planet. And through my work, I'm an activist for cannabis legalization and normalization in California and beyond.
So, did you start the law group with a focus on cannabis, or did it evolve?
It evolved. I started the law firm back in 2014 with a couple of partners, kind of based on the principle of most law firm life is kind of storied to be awful. And I worked in big law when I first came out of law school and was fairly mistreated as an associate, but got really good experience. And then I went.
Yeah, I watched The Good Wife, so I'm completely up on all that stuff. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Super, super. Actually, that's one of the more realistic ones of lawyer shows. I tend not to watch lawyer shows for that reason because I'm like, that's not how it happens. I digress. So I started at Astra Law Group kind of as a response to typical law firm life. And it was in 2015, so just a year after the law firm formed, that I got a referral to a cannabis consulting group in Oakland that had a breach of contract dispute. Well, I do breach of contract disputes and I know a lot about cannabis and I really like it. And so I went and met this
It's always good to have personal experience, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I went and met this husband-wife team that owned this business in Oakland that was facing this breach of contract lawsuit, and chatted them up and explained to them that I had, back in college, I wrote position papers about the racist roots of cannabis prohibition and why it should be decriminalized across the country. And it's always been something that's near and dear to my heart. And then the cannabis world was very much who you know. And so this particular group asked me, have you ever represented anyone in cannabis before? And thankfully I was able to say yes, because I had an ex-boyfriend from high school who was a grower in Oakland who's got more money than sense sometimes. And I bailed him out of a couple of bad partnerships and a couple of bad contracts. And so I was able to say, yes, I worked with this individual on some of his various business pursuits, and they knew him because this world in Oakland is pretty small. And so I called him up and he said, yeah, Katy is legit. I've known her since junior high. So I got that one client, and that kind of started off a chain as that client then had multiple different disputes happen, a dispute with their employees. They had a securities fraud issue in addition to the breach of contract. I mean, this poor business was catching it from all angles. And I went to my two other co-founding partners and said, I think we found something here. There's no other law firms advertising that they'll do this kind of work. And I discovered this group of mostly really kick-ass women lawyers out of San Francisco who were kind of leading the charge on sophisticated transactional lawyering for cannabis businesses. And this was in the pre-Malcursa days, before 2018. This was back in 2015, 2016. And I said, I think we found something here. And I think we should really pursue this because we have sophisticated business litigation skills, employment litigation skills, real estate litigation skills to bring to the cannabis industry, where it's mostly the lawyering at that point was done by criminal defense attorneys who had necessarily had to switch their practice from doing the hard work of keeping people out of jail for accessing medicine, switching them to forming corporations and writing contracts and then litigating when those things go wrong. And so I saw the opportunity, and I called my insurance broker and I told her what I was up to. And she said, well, I'm way ahead of you, sister. I've been writing you on cannabis lines for years because that's where I see the market going. And it was just absolutely kismet. Right place, right time, preparation met opportunity. I said yes. And then that one client that first hired me, when they had those multiple problems, they got pretty far behind in their invoice with me. And I was like, guys, what are we going to do about this? And they said, look, we never met anyone like you. We intend to pay you every dime. But as you know, money's tight because I just settled a bunch of cases for them. And they said, how about we pay you every dime, but in exchange for the slow pay, the interest rate's going to be, we take you around to every party and every conference and introduce you to everyone we know. That was an absolute hell yes. Right. And that's how I met, through a trademark issue that this first client had, that's how I met the original founders of what was then the National Cannabis Bar Association, a group of really kick-ass women lawyers out of Oakland who focus on transactional intellectual property rights and who had started this bar association. So I got in with them and I hung around with this group of amazing lawyers until they elected me as their leader. Worked out for me.
There you go. So let's be clear though. You're not talking about business setup. You're talking about disputes, and just let's be clear, right?
We are fighters, not lovers. I will not form a corporation. I generally will not write a contract, but I will tell you that's a terrible contract that you're about to sign. Please God, don't sign that. I will defend you if someone says you've breached a contract. I will bring a claim if someone's defrauded you or your business partner's messing with you. The types of cases that I love the best are partnership disputes, where the owners of generally a closely held business, sometimes a larger corporation, have either shareholder disputes or fights amongst the board of directors and disputes between the directors and officers. We do a fair amount of corporate dispute that way. Oftentimes it's LLC members who are fighting each other for control of the limited liability corporation. We do a work where, pretty much anytime you're taking money from an investor, not giving them voting rights, it's probably not giving them voting rights, it's probably a security, and it probably needs to be cleared through the feds. Even though cannabis is still federally illegal, there's still securities laws that apply across the board. Same thing for employment disputes, right? Even though banking is difficult to access, you still have to pay your employees on time and withhold the taxes, and not, there's no such thing as an independent contractor in California anymore, hardly, after the Dynamics case that came out a couple years ago. We also handle a lot of disputes in the real estate space, having to do with purchase and sale of land that would be used for a cannabis grow, leasing disputes for indoor grows, dispensaries, you name it. We represent businesses across the supply chain, from seed to sale, ancillary businesses, you name it. If shit hit the fan in your business, I'm the one to call. But we don't do proactive. I'm just the undertaker. You don't want to have to hire me.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, we get that. So, you've been doing this, what is it, 6 going on 7 years?
Yeah, since 2015. So 6 years.
The landscape has changed considerably during that period, right? You've seen the green rush, it's come and gone, and, I don't know where it currently is. What's sort of the biggest changes that you see in the industry right now?
So within California, I'm seeing an increased sophistication in the level of disputes that come across my desk. Where, at this point, a couple years in from the January 1, 2018 implementation of the regulations under California's MALCURSA, Medical and Adult Use Cannabis Recreation and Safety Act. Now that we've had a couple years under our belts, the companies that were never going to survive have mostly died off, or they've been absorbed. The ones that are going to make it are the ones that are lasting. And litigation is a real risk for all of these businesses, because people have this kind of notion that money grows on trees. But in fact, it is very difficult to turn a profit in the cannabis business in the United States, given the effect of IRS Section 280E. So I'm seeing that, a lot of companies that are still around, it's because they're getting better assistance from knowledgeable professionals who know how to, cost segregate and allocate funds amongst multi-entity business structures in order to make what is ultimately a viable family of companies. I'm seeing more big law firms enter the space and offer more sophisticated legal work. I'm seeing even the mom and pop operators from before who were really resistant to deal with lawyers because of their long history of really not being able to access the justice system. These folks are now coming around to, okay, it's time for me to enter the regulated market. It's time for me to come out of the woodwork, because the state wants people to register and get licensed as a legal entity in the state of California to conduct cannabis business. And the state is trying to squelch out the illicit market, which is still thriving and alive very well. Let's see, what else can I say about what I'm seeing?
Speaking of the state, one of the things that we're seeing is this idea of equity. So can you sort of talk a little bit about, where the movement is towards, equity and what that means, and what we can expect from that?
Absolutely. So the concept of social or economic equity in cannabis is huge. If you followed or know anything about the history of prohibition of cannabis in the United States, it came about in the Nixon administration, mostly targeted towards our Black and brown brethren, to keep them away from this. It was never meant to stay on Schedule 1 forever. No one actually believes that cannabis is more dangerous than cocaine, and yet that's actually the way it's set up. And our jails are full of our Black and brown brothers and sisters who are being prosecuted for what white men are now making a killing off of. The idea of social and economic justice is being implemented in states that have medicinal or adult use cannabis rules. And that is simply the idea that to the extent that you or your family, in some cases, has been a victim of the failed war on drugs with respect to cannabis, the jurisdiction is going to give you somewhat of a pass to the front of the line to be one of the first to get a license to open and operate a cannabis-based business in the jurisdiction. So for instance, in Oakland, if you were from a certain area, had a conviction from a certain area for cannabis possession or sale, you would be given this proverbial pass to the front of the line in the form of a different license type called a social equity license that has some more lax rules, and they can form micro businesses instead of having, that are vertically integrated on a smaller scale. There's all sorts of perks for social equity applicants, which is the term for it. And then in San Francisco, when the city of San Francisco rolled out their social equity program, for a long time, it was the God honest truth that there was no hope of opening a cannabis business in the city of San Francisco unless you got in on a social equity license. And so it's great idea in theory. In practice, it's fraught with all sorts of problems. Problem number one, I think because of the systemic violence and racism directed at communities of color, these folks are generally less interested in coming out and saying, hey, I've been convicted for cannabis possession and sale, and I want to operate a legal business in the city of San Francisco. Let me go ahead and file this application with the man and see if I can't get my license. There's a disconnect there. Just start. And then secondly, even with the social equity license type, the cost of starting a cannabis business in the state of California, because you have to have pretty much the entire business, starting with the lease and all the way through your security plan and your environmental review and all that has to be in place before your application gets approved. So it's a huge capital outlay before there's any money that could even possibly come in because the licensing isn't in. So it means that these social equity applicants, who generally tend to be less capitalized and less educated than, for instance, the money parts that come in, there's investors and other groups who come in and say, okay, we also want to operate a dispensary in San Francisco, but we're not going to be able to get in for years because we're not social equity applicants. So they pair up with the equity applicants, and then a lot of these work out really nicely. Business people who are using their funding and their Harvard business degrees to really move the needle forward on cannabis normalization and cannabis decriminalization, and really moving the needle forward on social equity and social justice in cannabis. There are just as many, if not more, who are the wolf in sheep's clothing and form go ahead and have the social equity applicant enter into extraordinarily abusive contracts that ultimately strip the social equity applicant of the power that the equity program wants them to have. For instance, in San Francisco, the social equity applicant is supposed to be the CEO and at least 40% owner of the company so that they retain control. But we all know that control is money and money is control. So like I said, it's a great idea in theory. In practice, it needs some work. And also, it's not statewide. Every jurisdiction gets to determine whether and how to allow commercial cannabis within the jurisdictional limits. And that necessarily means that they can A, ban all commercial cannabis activity, and B, they can choose to have different licensing types, including having a social equity license. And so far, there's only a few jurisdictions out of the 537 in California that even offer a social equity tier of licensure. So the idea is out there, being refined over time. And, I really hope that we find a way to integrate more the social justice aspect of cannabis decriminalization. I should also mention that the impact of AI, artificial intelligence, with the passing of California's Medical and Adult Use Regulation and Safety Act, there's supposed to be expungement of previous convictions, and statewide, it's on the person with the conviction to go get their expungement, whereas the city of San Francisco used an AI program to go ahead and automatically expunge all those convictions that were out there. And the city of New York is doing the same thing because New York just legalized. It's fabulous.
And somewhere else, if I recall?
New Mexico yesterday. Yeah, the green wave is sweeping.
You heard it here, exactly.
Yep, you'll go ride that high tide.
How do all these activities then tie back into what you guys are doing with the International Cannabis Bar Association?
Oh man, the Cannabis Bar Association is just where it's at for cutting edge knowledge on not only the politics of cannabis, but the evolving law in cannabis, and really the place to go for meeting other professionals who are super knowledgeable in the space in their area. Because one thing that's really important about cannabis is that it's hyper local. State by state, the regulations differ, city by city, county by county, the regulations differ. And that seems to be true across the country. Local control it's kind of the political compromise to address the NIMBY problem, not in my backyard. So the Cannabis Bar Association, our whole mission, education, to give to other professionals, to give the most cutting edge continuing legal education about the issues facing the cannabis industry and how lawyers are handling it, some of the best lawyers in the world that do this sort of work, forming a community that's used for networking and passing referrals. And frankly, we throw the best parties. We've been thrown out of every Vegas hotel room we've been into. Do you remember parties, Mr. Doherty?
No, it's been a very long time.
Right?
I haven't left my house. Are you kidding me?
Right. Well, I put on a Zoom top for you, and I definitely did my hair and took a shower, put on some makeup. So I really appreciate it. I'm feeling very fancy today.
I have been in a hole. That's why I'm this pasty. Apparently, I haven't been out of the house, right?
Got it. The other tenets of the Bar Association are access and leadership, access to other members who are super knowledgeable in their area of the law, super supportive network. And then, I think by definition of being involved in the Cannabis Bar Association this early on, all of us are leaders in the space. And, when it comes to lawyering, especially the dispute work that I do, there is not a lot of precedent out there. There's no other cases I can point to say this is how so-and-so court handled a dispute between cannabis businesses in the past, that it almost does not exist. And so by definition, a lot of the work that I'm doing and that my colleagues are doing is bleeding edge work, not just cutting edge, but bleeding edge. We are actually forming and shaping the legal landscape as we're doing it. I like to tell people I do the same kind of work as everyone else, except that I'm doing it surfing on a hot lava flow.
How is the federal environment changed? I know a couple of years ago they were going into Oakland and doing raids and all that kind of stuff. Are they sort of ignoring that? Are they enforcing anything? Will things change on the federal level? What's your take on that?
Oh man, so the federal enforcement perspective right now is mostly relies on what's called the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment, which is a budget right that prevents the Federal Department of Justice from spending any funds to prosecute a state legal medical cannabis business, not adult use, but medical, to the extent that that medical cannabis business is completely compliant with the state's underlying laws. Now, if you've read through the cannabis regulations under Malcursa and what's come out since, it's practically impossible to be in compliance with all things at all times. So the risk of federal enforcement is still out there. And in no other industry are we, generating multi-billions of dollars in flagrant violation of federal law. But the Department of Justice is mostly hamstrung to do anything about it. And that came down, that was the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment was actually, it gets redone every year. So I think it was just renewed. And so we're not seeing a lot of enforcement going on. There's still always the risk of civil asset forfeiture for professionals and for landowners, because to the extent that the business is non-compliant or violates the Controlled Substances Act, there's a risk that the federal government could come in and seize your assets. Not seeing that very much anymore. And so the name of the game is compliance. to the extent that the business is compliant with the rules of their jurisdiction to the T, the risk of federal enforcement is pretty low. The other thing too, if you're compliant with all those regulations, then you're necessarily steering clear of what we call the dirty 8 from the Cole memo back in 2013. This was a federal government guidance back in 2013 that said basically, to the extent that state legal medical cannabis businesses are not selling to kids or growing on federal land or cartel activity, and there's a list of 8 things that the government has an enforcement priority on, which things that make sense, like don't sell to kids, don't sell to cartels, that sort of deal. So Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole memo in 2018, but in its place, essentially prosecutors should use their discretion given the limited resources that the government has, which is government speak for I'm doing this big chest puffing move to go ahead and rescind the Cole memo, but carry on as usual.
Yeah. And what about, have we seen, there used to be, like the doctor that would give you a card for medicinal, if you went in with $25 and a headache. Have they gone away, or are they still out there? Where is that?
They're still out there. Certainly their industry's taken a hit, but medicinal use is still huge. There's a different taxation level for it. You can have more plants at your residence if you have a medicinal card. So there still are benefits. And certainly given what I just articulated about federal government enforcement, right? If you're at all concerned, go for the medical cannabis space. If you're a consumer, go get your medical cannabis card. It'll help you sleep better at night. Not the end of the world, but yeah, certainly that industry took a hit, because not everyone needs that card anymore. Not everyone needs a medical recommendation anymore to go obtain cannabis. You just have to be over 21. And then of course the illicit market is still thriving. So if you've only got $20, I'm sure there's a guy on the corner in Oakland.
And is the illicit market thriving because of the taxes imposed? Why do you think it's thriving? Is it the taxes that are imposed?
Yeah, because legal cannabis is expensive. Legal cannabis is very, very expensive. Not only the product itself, but then the taxation on top of that. And for a lot of people, the elderly and some more economically distressed communities, if they have a choice between a $70 eighth that's been it's organic and it's been tested, and although organic isn't really a thing in cannabis, but in any event, it's
definitely not a thing in medicinal. It can't be organic.
No. So if you're going for the really fancy weed in the pretty jar that's $70 an eighth, you can still get an ounce for 200. People are still going to go get the ounce of weed that their friend grew, as opposed to the fancy cannabis. It's really, I kind of think that all legal cannabis to an extent is luxury cannabis. And same thing with communities of color who have been systematically trained to fear any sort of law enforcement. Right? These people don't necessarily want to walk into a dispensary and show their ID,
right?
Because they've been systematically trained that only bad things can come from this sort of thing. So again, it harkens back to the illicit market. It's just easier to go with what you know.
Yeah, show your ID, be tracked, be in their system, and then your purchases.
Some people really don't like that.
Yeah, and there's other concerns about. Because I know there's a lot of cybersecurity concerns around that, right? Because what we don't want is you may have this is medicinal, so it should be private. This is health information and health data. So what we don't want is that information conveyed to your employer, things like that.
Yeah.
So are I don't know if you know this, but are the medical facilities HIPAA compliant?
I don't know this for all the way certain, but it strikes me that to the extent that you have a recommendation from your doctor, it is protected by HIPAA. And again, I don't think we have any law on this, but to the extent that someone wanted to subpoena a dispensary's records to see if you purchased from that particular dispensary, if you had a medical card, I would argue that motion all day. I would argue against subpoena in court and say, no, this is covered by HIPAA. This is private protected medical information. And then with California's fairly new Privacy Act, which is the sort of the equivalent of the big European
GDPR,
GDPR. I think it's called CCPA. There's a lot of software solutions that cannabis businesses in California need to implement in order to become CCPA compliant and meet those privacy concerns and be able to, completely delete people's data upon request.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too is which is really important, is how they choose to communicate, particularly with the medicinal clients. On a non-cannabis related example, we have a client that is a chiropractor that was texting. We're like, you can't do that because texting is not a secure channel. So, we had to tell them, no, stop, you can't do that. You won't be in compliance. So, I mean, to the degree that these facilities, they need to be in compliance with how they're communicating with these folks as well, so that they don't violate HIPAA laws.
Oh, I will also mention that so text messages are a big deal for cannabis dispensaries because there is a rash of TCPA litigation, Telephone Consumer Privacy Act. So to the extent that you're getting text messages from your dispensary and you haven't specifically approved those, there is a cottage industry of plaintiffs lawyers who are going around and suing everyone for these TCPA violations. In fact, the TCPA cases are the most commonly filed federal lawsuit. It's a real risk for people. I've had some TCPA cases where my client was a wealthy corporation that bought existing delivery service and just didn't vet their text message practices and got hit with a gnarly lawsuit for that.
Yeah, there's not much there's not a defense to that, right?
Yeah.
Not doing your due diligence is not a defense.
No, it is not.
Right. So what do you see on the horizon? What do we expect? Hopefully, when things return to whatever normal will be, but what do you see on the horizon?
So I think more and more people are getting used to the idea of cannabis in the mainstream. And I think certainly COVID and being home and having cannabis workers deemed as essential workers has really helped change the stigma. And then with the new Biden-Harris administration, I expect that Kamala Harris, a politician, woman of color from the San Francisco Bay Area, who has seen firsthand, because of her experience as a prosecutor, who has seen the devastation that cannabis prohibition causes to communities, and that it does in fact have medicinal properties. I think I saw a headline yesterday saying that the Biden administration is eyeing what to do about medical cannabis. So if anything, the federal government is going to address medical cannabis first.
Right? Yeah, it's a safer approach. Yeah.
Right. Because no one's going to argue with sick kids. Right.
Yeah.
Stony adults like you and I, not as.
Yeah, all right.
So I expect to see some movement in the Biden-Harris administration. I have heard tale through my connections that Senator Cory Booker's office is already working and spending this year writing policy that will be voted on next year. And that seems like a reasonable timeline for me. I've been saying for a long time, I think we're 2 years out. So certainly don't hold your breath for any of that. But as the green wave is sweeping the nation, we now have, I think, 17 states and DC that have some form of medical or adult use, if not both, cannabis, and out of the 50 states. And it's just coming up more and more and more. And that's part of the mission of the Bar Association that I run, is to make sure that those lawyers in states that are brand new to cannabis have access to learn from the very, very best in the business from across the world. As all these new localities that are implementing medicinal and adult use cannabis laws, they're not coming up with this stuff from scratch. They're watching what's happening in other states. And so, we very much learn from each other and build the landscape as we're going along.
And one of the challenges that we see is, some of the really big players, right? They're the big gorillas in the space, and they tend to stomp all over local. How do we deal with that?
Oh, it's a tough question, breaking question. All right, this is, I think, why a lot of people voted against Prop 64, which would have been the adult use cannabis legalization, or decriminalization rather, in California. a lot of people voted against it because they saw coming the exact thing that has happened, is that the big conglomerates, the big multi-state operators have come in, the Canadian public markets have come into California and bought up a bunch of mom and pop shops, a bunch of mom and pop grows, and it's overall turned out pretty badly for the mom and pops out there. Because as I cited earlier, it's practically very difficult and expensive to get a licensed legal cannabis business going in the state of California. I mean, I had someone call me once and be like, I got $100,000. Can I start a business? And I was like, 10x that, and then get a few more investors and then call me back. Maybe I can introduce you to someone who can do it. But no, you and your $100,000, you got nothing going on here. So then there's a legacy cash problems. A lot of these, longtime industry pioneers, they've got money. They've got money that's never entered the system. So there's some issues there. I see a lot of unlicensed yet very talented growers enter contracts with licensed grow facilities in order to sort of share crop. It's a terrible racist word, but in one of the cases I have in Sacramento, the parties actually referred to their arrangement as a sharecropping agreement. And my clients spent their own money to outfit the outdoor grow and harvest the cannabis themselves. And then the guy who owned the licensed grow showed up, sold the weed, didn't pay my guys a dime. It's pretty.
Not a lot of recourse, right?
There's lawsuits. And that's what we're doing, and it's a terrible form of recourse. Lawsuits are awful for everybody involved. So yeah, those mom and pops out there are getting taken advantage of, especially the Canadian money that came in 2019. I saw a rash of those sorts of cases where mom and pops sold out to Canadians in a reverse merger and not realizing that for the low cost of the $300,000 they got up front, they've actually lost control of their entire life's business.
Yeah, because we saw that in Europe where, because in Europe what they did is mostly medicinal and they only offered a few licenses. And then of course, in order to participate, like you said, you had to have millions, so, there was no local grow, there was no local entrepreneur. That was never going to happen. What we hope and what we've always sort of thought from our side was that when we get into more of a recreational usage, then maybe what will happen is you'll start to see more of like sort of the craft beer model, where people who care about where it's grown, whether it is indeed organic, and what it's grown with and how and all those types of things, and whether or not it's grown in a sustainable environment versus, the way we produce medicinal products, which just basically takes, tons of energy and stuff like that.
I'm glad you mentioned the connoisseur theory. I should mention the push for appellations in cannabis, the same way that we have appellations for wine, like Bag's Leap District, or this one was grown in the Carneros region, or this one was from Champagne, France. Having that same agricultural model applied to cannabis, applied to craft cannabis, as we're saying.
Right.
Where it is, how the soil is, what the water source is, all that sort of thing. Because
it's grown outside, it's not grown under lights, that type of
right.
thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Hopefully we'll definitely see more sustainable usage than we're currently seeing in the medicinal.
Right. I mean, even the packaging, right? There's a push to have the packaging be more sustainable because there's so many proofing requirements and such.
Yeah, we're hoping to see hemp packaging, right?
Yeah.
Full use of the plant and stuff like that.
Totally.
Any sort of closing thoughts or something profound, which I know is putting a lot of pressure on you? Like, come up with something profound. Any closing thoughts before we go away? I'm
just full of dropping wisdom on you. Well, I can say, for those of you who are already involved in the industry, the best piece of advice I can give you, or if you're looking to get into the industry, the best piece of advice I can give you is to hire the right professionals, people who know this space like the back of their hand, know the regulators, understand what's going on. Your friend's son who went to law school is not the lawyer for you on this matter. And if you're having trouble finding someone, Yamame, I'll hook you up. Go check out the association.
Just because you've been smoking a long time doesn't make you an expert.
Correct. Maybe an expert on smoking, but definitely not the law.
Exactly.
Well, this was really fun. Thank you.
Thank you. We very much appreciate your time, and we look forward to staying in touch. So again, we will put your website in below so that folks can
let me say one more thing. If
Sure,
you're interested
one more
in
thing.
joining, if you're interested in joining the Bar Association, use my last name, Young, Y-O-U-N-G, for a 15% discount off of your membership.
Wow. See that? It's worth it just to pay attention, right?
Yep.
Again, thank you very much. We appreciate it, and have a great day, and hope to talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
Thanks.